Welcome to Pretense of Justice News Update. We keep our pulse on legal issues. We are compassionate, informative, and driven. We advocate justice for all. We are Pretense of Justice. Let the justice begin. Welcome to the Pretense of Justice News Update. Let's get into today's update. Today's update is coming from the Prison Policy Initiative, and this is following the money of mass incarceration. The cost of imprisonment, including who benefits and who pays, is a major part of the national discussion around criminal justice policy. But prisons and jails are just one piece of the criminal justice system, and the amount of media and policy attention that the various players get is not necessarily proportional to their influence. In this first of its kind report, we find that the system of mass incarceration costs the government and families of justice involved people at least $182 billion each year in this report. In this report, we provide the significant cost of our globally unprecedented system of mass incarceration and over-criminalization. We give the relative importance of the various parts. We highlight some of the under-discussed yet costly parts of the system, and then we share all of our sources so that journalists and advocates can build upon our work. Okay, so here they have a graph breaking down the $182 billion cost of mass incarceration. So they're estimating judicial and legal criminal law only is $29 billion. And they break it down even a little bit further underneath that. They have prosecution, $5.8 billion, indigent defense, $4.5. Oh, wow, this is interesting. Policing, criminal law only, $63.2 billion. And then if you go over for public corrections, so meaning agencies, prisons, jail, parole, and probations, $80.7 billion. Public employees, $38.4 billion. And healthcare, $12.3 billion. Okay, so that's that. All right, so our goal with this report is to give a hint as to how the criminal justice system works by identifying some of the key stakeholders and quantifying their stake in the status quo. Our visualization shows how wide and how deep mass incarceration and over-criminalization have spread into our economy. We find almost half of the money spent on running the correctional system goes to paying staff. This group is an influential lobby that sometimes prevents reform and whose influence is often protected even when prison populations drop. The criminal justice system is overwhelmingly a public system, with private prison companies acting only as extensions of the public system. The government payroll for correction employees is over 100 times higher than the private prison industry profits. Despite the fact that the Constitution requires counsel to be appointed for defendants unable to afford legal representation, the system only spends $4.5 billion on this right. And over the last decade, states have been reducing this figure even as caseloads have grown. Private companies that supply goods to prison commissary or provide telephone service for correctional facilities bring in almost as much money, $2.9 billion, as governments pay private companies $3.9 billion to operate private prisons. Feeding and providing health care for 2.3 million people, a population larger than that of 15 states, is expensive. This report and infographic are a first step towards better understanding who benefits from mass incarceration and who might be restrained to reform. We have no doubt that we missed some costs, and we did not include some costs because they are relatively small in the big picture or are currently unknowable. But by following the money, one can see that private prison corporations aren't the only ones who benefit from mass incarceration. Some of the lesser-known players in the system of mass incarceration and overcriminalization are bail bond companies that collect $1.4 billion in non-refundable fees from defendants and their families. The industry also actively works to block reform that threatens its profits, even if the reform could prevent people from being detained in jail because of their poverty. Specialized phone companies that win monopoly contracts and charge families up to $25 for a 15-minute phone call. Commissary vendors that sell goods to incarcerated people who rely largely on money sent by loved ones is an even larger industry that brings in $1.6 billion a year. A graphic like this shows the relative economic costs of different parts of mass incarceration, but it can also obscure the fact that we don't have a single monolithic system. Instead, we have a federal system, 50 state systems, and thousands of local government systems. Sometimes these systems work together, although often they do not, and looking at just the national picture can obscure the importance of state and local policy decisions. For example, while state government spending makes up a majority of 57% of correctional costs, local governments make up almost a third, 32%. Local governments are largely enforcing state law and local discretionary arrests, and bail policies can have tremendous influence on both the state budget and justice outcomes. For example, more than half, $13.6 billion of the cost running local jails is spent detaining people who have not been convicted. To be sure, there are ideological as well as economic reasons for mass incarceration and overcriminalization. But at this moment, when crime is near record lows and there is increasing attention to the role of privatization in the justice system, we need a far more expansive view of how our criminal justice system works, whom it hurts, and whom it really serves. If we are to make our society safer and stronger, we need to be making far smarter investments than we are today. Methodology and data sources. While this report asks a few simple questions about the financial costs of mass incarceration, a comprehensive answer has never existed before because the government doesn't collect or organize these statistics in one place. Like our report, Mass Incarceration, the Whole Pie, which looked at who is behind bars and why, this report aggregates economic data that have never been put together before to offer a big picture view of who pays for and who benefits from mass incarceration. Before we explain our sources and methodology, it might be helpful to explain our goals and how this report's finding that mass incarceration consumes at least $182 billion each year is different than the two more commonly cited Bureau of Justice statistic figures. 81 billion addressing only the cost of running the correctional system, prisons, jail, parole, and probation, thereby missing the policing and court costs and all the other costs that families have to pay to support their incarcerated loved ones. 265 billion includes the cost of federal, state, and local corrections and the entire police and court systems. This figure does not separate out the civil parts of the police and court system, nor does it address the collateral costs paid by the families of incarcerated people. This report's goal is to identify the total costs of mass incarceration and the comparative investment that each part of the system has in the status quo. We wanted to take a holistic view without also exaggerating our findings by including tens of billions of dollars in policing and court expenses that have little to do with the enforcement of criminal law. In general, this report includes a number of firsts, including the identification of sufficient data points to develop national estimates where none existed before. But our approach does have a few weaknesses that other researchers building on this work should be aware of. We decided not to include any expenses that do not appear to add up at least $1 billion a year, for example, the money transfer industry or the release card industry. There are many items for which there are no national statistics available and no straightforward way to develop a national figure from the limited state and local data. For example, criminal justice fines and fees can be substantial. In at least 38 towns and cities in the U.S., more than 10% of all revenue is collected from court fines and fees. In St. Louis County, 5 towns generated more than 40% of their annual revenue from court fines and fees in 2013. Given the tremendous variability between different jurisdictions, we did not see a way to develop a national figure and decided not to provide one at all. However, the existing research makes it clear that the insidious yet largely invisible system of fines and fees should be priority for research to drive policy reform. Our effort to separate out the civil components of policing and judicial and legal expenditures cannot be considered complete, and some technical civil costs are included in our report. As we explain in the sections on policing and judicial and legal systems below, our adjustments is both rough and subject to definitional weakness. We would, for future reports, be interested in seeing studies that estimate the civil versus the criminal breakdown in individual jurisdictions in order to improve our national estimates. Moreover, we do include the cost of civil immigration detentions. While these facilities and the confinements that are technically civil, in reality, they are quite like prisons. We also include civil asset forfeitures because civil asset forfeiture is a mechanism by which law enforcement agencies can seize and retain property on the suspicion that the property is connected to a crime. There are other categories where the information is incomplete and therefore undercounts the cost. For example, as we discussed in the public employees section below, the figures for public employees doesn't include state and local contributions to retire pensions because many governments make lump sum contributions to retirement systems and cannot separate out justice employees. Because existing data systems were never designed to give this kind of holistic view, this report may significantly understate the total fiscal cost. Another cost not included in this report are the payouts that result from people suing criminal justice agencies for civil rights, personal injury, and employment claims. We did not include this cost because the only reliable way to quantify these expenses is to individually check jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Many jurisdictions use special funds or risk retention pools to pay this type of legal liability, and all payouts are budgeted to the centralized fund rather than the agency, which is responsible for the underlying claim. Okay, so as we continue through this, going through the last 2 points, I hope we are understanding the gist that the total cost that they are giving us for the justice system is underestimated. Okay, we don't fully track how money paid by families or seized from defendants is then used by the system. For example, private telephone and commissary companies often kick back a portion of their revenue to the government entity that awarded the contract. Now, that's interesting because it is said, well, they kind of told you in this report that these phone companies are charging $25 for 15 minutes. So if they are providing revenue kickbacks, of course, the telephone company providing this service is passing on that kickback to the customers. While important, this revenue often goes to the state or county's general fund, so we chose not to include that complication. Similarly, revenue from civil asset forfeiture is generally used to benefit the police or district attorney's office. We don't adjust for inflation, and some of our data are older than others. In particular, the only known data for food, 2001, utilities, 2001, and healthcare, 2008, are particularly old and are surely a significant understatement of current costs. We considered adjusting the data for inflation, but concluding that it would not measurably change the ratio between the different parts of the system. We also thought it would make follow-up work by other researchers and advocates unnecessarily complicated, since finding the rare available figures is already difficult. What follows is a description of the data sources and the assumptions used for each part of the infograph. Each circle area is in the proportion with the value being represented. We welcome ideas on newer data sources, more precise estimates, and information on the costs that we missed. Okay, so we're going to go through these data sources. Judicial and legal, the Bureau of Justice Statistic reports that the combined total of federal, state, and local expenditures on the judicial and legal system was $57.9 billion in 2012. Oh, these figures are old. But these figures include both criminal and civil law aspect of the court system. We reduced this figure by world-renowned criminologist Niels Christie's estimates that 50% of court expenditures, were criminal law related, with rounding our figures to 29 billion. Okay. While our calculations are aimed at excluding costs associated with civil justice system, it is important to recognize that mass incarceration has substantial economic impacts on civil courts. First, a material portion of the federal court's workload consists of habeas corpus petitions, motions to vacate sentences, complaints involving prison conditions, and cases concerning the civil rights of incarcerated people. These are all reported as civil matters, even though they are driven by the system's mass criminalization. Now, that's interesting. Data from the federal court system shows that such matters constituted 20% of district court civil filings and 40% of appellate court civil filings in the year ending March 2015. Second, courts' criminal caseloads can squeeze out civil cases. Since 1986, workloads for federal judges have increased, driven by increase in criminal cases. Unlike civil cases, criminal defendants have a right to a speedy trial, which means that as criminal workload increases, judges are sometimes forced to prioritize criminal cases, resulting in a slower pace for civil matters and imposing opportunity costs on civil litigants. Presumably, this dynamic is even more acute in state courts, which handles more criminal cases than federal system. Judicial and legal expenditures include expenses for prosecutors, $5.8 billion in 2007, and for an indigent defense, $4.5 billion in 2008. The indigent defense expense include both public defender agency and private counsel appointed by the courts, but it would not include the currently unknown number of billions paid by individuals and families to private defense and appellate attorneys. Okay, that's a great point. And notably, judicial and legal costs do not include monetary payments paid by governments when it is sued in a judicial or administrative proceeding. All right, so let's go to policing. The Bureau of Statistics reports in Justice and Expenditure and Employment Extract 2012 that the combined total of federal, state, and local expenditures on policing was $126.4 billion in 2012. And all I keep thinking of as we're reading through this is these numbers are 2012. So they're 11 years old. And at the rate of inflation that we are witnessing now, wow. Unfortunately and significantly, these figures do not include separate costs for the criminal and civil components of police work. So we use Neil Christie's estimate that 50% of police expenditures are related to the enforcement of the criminal law to reduce the Bureau of Justice Statistics figures by half. We also note a Cincinnati, Ohio study which found that police officers spend 33% of their time patrolling and 17% on crime calls. There is obviously an urgent need for more precise data on police expenditures for projects like this report, and more importantly, to help state and local governments make useful comparative policy decisions about what are and what are not appropriate duties for law enforcement. In addition, note that because in most states, sheriff's departments are multifunctional agencies providing police protection, judicial or correctional services, sheriff expenditures are prorated by function to corrections, policing, and judicial and legal. That's a good point also. So, in other words, you have these agencies doing multi-functions. Civil asset forfeiture. Our $4.5 billion figure reflects the net assets of the Department of Justice and Treasury forfeiture funds in fiscal year 2014, as reported on page 10 in the Institute for Justice 2015 report, Policing for Profit, the Abuse of Civil Forfeiture, second edition. According to the Institute for Justice, net assets are a more stable metric than annual deposits into the forfeiture fund, over $5 billion, because net assets measure the funds remaining after the government pays various obligations like payments to victims. Notably, this figure is an undercount of the total because it does not include state forfeiture revenue. Interesting. According to the Institute of Justice, unfortunately, deriving similar totals at the state level is impossible because most states require little to no public reporting on forfeiture activities. Wow, who would have known that? However, of the 26 states from which the Institute for Justice was able to obtain usable data, the totals are more than 254 million. There is likely some overlap between the 4.5 billion net assets of the Department of Justice and Treasury forfeiture funds and the expenditures reported for the policing and judicial and legal systems. We didn't adjust the policing and judicial and legal system figures because it is likely impossible to figure out how much overlap there is and to determine how the money is distributed among the various government agencies. The federal government and state vary in what percentage of the seized property can be kept by law enforcement agencies that seize the property. While this report adjusts policing and judicial and legal costs to focus on criminal parts of these systems and exclude the civil parts, we include civil asset forfeiture because civil asset forfeiture is a mechanism by which law enforcement agencies can seize and retain property on the suspicion that the property is connected to a crime. Okay, so that's very interesting on civil asset forfeitures. I did not realize that they didn't have to disclose publicly exactly what's going on with it. That's interesting. Bail fees. In its report for Better or Profit, how the bail bonding industry stands in the way of fair and effective pretrial justice, the Justice Policy Institute uses a figure of $14 billion in bail bonds written every year and cites its source as an email from Dennis Bartlett from the American Bail Coalition, which lobbies on behalf of bail bondsman industry, in footnote 2 of the executive summary of the report. Since defendants and their family members typically pay 10% to commercial bail bond agency as a non-refundable fee, this comes out to $1.4 billion actually paid by the families. To learn more about the high cost of the money bail in the report, you can click here, and I will put this particular report in the description of this video so you can definitely drill down deeper into this report on how they got the source for the report. Commissary. For our calculations of the total value of commissary expenditures, see Stephen Raher's Paging Antitrust Lawyers, Prison Commissary Giants Prepare to Merge. And that was in 2016. We assign incarcerated people's commissary purchases to a section on money spent by families precisely because incarcerated people don't make very much money. Many people confined in jails don't work, and 4 state prison systems don't pay at all. And the states that pay for work aren't much better. Looking at just the states that paid incarcerated people for non-industry work in 2001, the average minimum wage per day was 93 cents. Therefore, the majority of the money spent on commissary comes from the families of incarcerated people and not from the incarcerated people themselves. As with the telephone industry below, a portion of the cost to the families feeds back into the $81 billion correctional budget via the corrupt commission system, where private companies provide commissary services for correctional facilities but share a percentage of the revenue with the government. In this way, it's possible we are counting these dollars twice in our total estimate, although our methodology of ignoring costs under $1 billion more than makes up for any double counting in this respect. Okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's get into it. Telephone calls. Lee Petro, pro bono counsel for the right petitioners, analyzed the 2015 financial report of 13 prison telephone companies, including the nation's largest, which were required to submit that information to Alabama state regulators. For one large company, CenturyLink, he used the 2014 figures because an accounting change at that company included its other non-prison related businesses in the 2015 figures, but he expects the telephone figures for CenturyLink to be generally unchanged from 2014 to 2015. Other companies not regulated by the state of Alabama are not included, so this is slightly underestimated. In some locations, these costs are physically paid by incarcerated people and in some cases by the family, but regardless of who makes the payments, the source of the funds is almost entirely the families. A large portion of this cost to the family feeds back into the $81 billion correctional budgets via the corrupt commission system, where contracts are awarded not on the basis of the best price and service to the consumer, but on the size of the revenue that is paid to the government authority that awards the monopoly contract. Okay, so again, now we should get the gist of why a phone call costs $25 for 15 minutes. In this way, it's possible we are counting these dollars twice in our total estimate, although our methodology of ignoring costs under $1 billion more than makes up for any double counting in this respect. Public corrections agencies. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that we combined total of federal, state, and local expenditures on corrections, which includes prisons, jails, juvenile facilities, probation and parole, and immigration detention, was $80.7 billion in 2012. Within this cost, we provide more detail. Public employees. We multiplied the March 2012 payroll amount of billion. Let's round it up, 3.2, for the 749,000 correction employees at the federal, state, and local level reported in the spreadsheet. Okay. All right. So by 12 to get an annual figure of 38.4 billion. Yay. This figure doesn't include state and local contributions to retiree pensions, because many governments make lump sum contributions to retirement systems and cannot separate out justice employees. Okay, and it said it doesn't include contractors. So at the gist of it, they were giving you, they were just giving you how they came up with the calculation. But bottom line, for public employees, they're giving a yearly cost of $38.4 billion. And this is still on the low side because they still didn't include any pensions, and they still did not include contractors. All right, so let's get to healthcare. Healthcare costs in the private and public prison systems cost at least $13.1 billion a year, and our estimate is based on data from 2008. Wow, that's pretty old. So they're telling us how they got the data, and I'm not going to go through that for the sake of time. So let me see here. Okay, so finding that the private prison operators are responsible for $0.747 billion in costs, which we consider too small to include. Okay, we understand that. And the government runs systems for $12 billion in costs. We share several cautions to subsequent researchers. Okay, so I'm not going to go through that. I just want us to get a gist of the cost because they're getting into the detailed statistics on how they came or derived at the $13.1 billion estimated costs for healthcare. And this is yearly. Okay, and remember, these are 2008 numbers. Okay, so construction. Because construction costs can be highly variable, we averaged several recent years when it was possible to do so. So let's just get to the cost because I'm not going to go through these details. So the total cost is $3.3 billion. All right, and they're averaging it out from the years of 2005 to 2014, and they break it down from the categories of local, state, and federal. All right, so they go into the interest payments. Do we want to do? Let's do interest payments because that's separate from construction costs. So just to recap, construction, they're doing an average. Over a few years, they're estimating $3.3 billion a year. Interest payments, many prisons are built with borrowed money. When the governments borrow money, they usually issue bonds that pay interest to investors, typically institutional investors such as pension funds. The principal amount of such bonds is already included in the construction cost segment of our graph. Because there is no available data on the interest expense associated with prison-specific bonds, we're calculating the figure as follows. So let's just get to the figure because they're going to tell us how they do it. So they're estimating the principal amount of $47.4 billion between 1998 and 2015. Okay, unfortunately, there is no way to know what interest rate the different bonds were paying, so we calculated interest by conservatively assuming an average rate of 4%. Whew, so that's pretty hefty. So if you look at construction, they're thinking $3.3 billion annually, and then just the interest on the bonds because they're selling the bonds in order to raise money. Okay, so they're selling the bonds to investors. Okay, so those, when you go to vote and they have on the ballot to issue bonds for X, Y, and Z, always remember those bonds, that particular agency still has to pay interest on those bonds. Okay? So a lot of times folks forget about that cost. So in this case, they're estimating as best that they can because they don't have the specifics on the interest rate and when the bond is going to maturity, but they're estimating about $47 billion. So for construction, literally you would have to add the $47 billion plus the $3.3 billion That's what it's costing to just build these facilities. Okay, food. Food is another large factor where the data is hard to assess. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports in state prisons expenditures 2001 that the per capita food cost was $955 per year, $2.62 per day. Multiplying this figure by 2.3 million incarcerated people produce a total annual expenditure of 2.197 billion. Because our visualization separates our private prisons, we multiply the annual figure and concluded that 125 million was too small to include in the graph. The far larger number of people confined in publicly run prisons, however, sums to 2.71 billion. Okay, so basically they're just telling you how they came up with this. They're saying food costs 2.1, let's just say 2.2 billion annually. Now, what was interesting to me is 262 per day. That's interesting. I know there has been a lot of heated discussion in the past about the quality of food in these facilities. So it's just interesting. Is it not enough money, or is it these contracts being awarded to vendors that are gouging? Just all sorts of things running through my mind with these particular figures. Very, very interesting. All right, let's continue. Utilities. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports in state prison expenditures 2001 that per capita utility cost was $795 per year. Multiplying this figure by 2.3 million incarcerated people produces a total expenditure of 1.8 billion. Because our visualization separates out private prisons, we multiply the annual figure, number of people in private prisons, and concluded that 104 million was too small to include in the report. Okay, so, all right, so bottom line, they're saying the publicly run number, they're estimating that utilities is 1.7 billion a year. Okay. Wow. That's a lot. But they're saying per person, $795 a year. Interesting. Private correction and private prison profits. Let me take a sip of water on this one. To illustrate both the scale of the private prison industry and the critical fact that this industry works under contract for government agencies rather than arresting, prosecuting, convicting, and incarcerating people on its own, we displayed these companies as a subset of the public correction system. This industry is dominated by two large publicly traded companies, Core Civics and the Geo Group, as well as one small private company, Management and Training Corp. We relied on the public annual reports of the two large companies and estimated MTC's figures using records from a decade-old public record request. In 2015, Core Civics received $911 million in federal money from various prison-related contracts. This equates to about 51% of its total revenue. Wow. Its state contracts made up 42% of its total revenue, or equivalent of $756 million in 2015. Adding these two figures together gets a total revenue for core civic from state and federal contract, $1.6 billion. All right, so their annual report says its net income, aka profit, was $220 million. All right, so it says these profits may also include profits beyond private prisons, such as providing transportation services, but we were not aware of a way to get that. They were not aware of a way to get that information. So let's get to the GEO group. So they had a total revenue of $1.8 billion. Whew. So let's see what their profit was. Just trying to get to their profit. They didn't give their profit here. Okay, well, let's read just real quick. So out of that 1.8 billion, you might as well say 2 billion. 340 million was from GeoCare, which includes electronic monitoring, residential youth facility. Wow, halfway houses. Wow. So their net income is 139 million. I did not realize that even halfway houses were being, I guess I can understand halfway houses being privatized, but I get it should make sense to me that these big companies would get into that as well. Using MTC's own records, let's look at MTC, what they're talking about. So we found that MTC had an average per incarcerated person revenue for, now this is 2005 and 2006 data, which is old. So per incarcerated person, they're making 15,000. You might as well round that up to 16,000. Using the current capacity of 31,000, we calculate that MTC's estimated current correctional revenue is $498 million, or right, $500 million. Wow. Okay, and they're estimating that they had like 13.4 million in profit. So as you can see, this is private prison is big business. These are billion-dollar corporations, with the exception of the smallest one, MTC. They're at $500 million. Now remember, these are older numbers. This was the data that they had available. So the incarceration rate has not gone down, so I'm assuming that these companies' revenue numbers have gone up. In sum, we estimate that the three companies received $3.9 billion in revenue from mass incarceration. Oh, wow. And immigration detention. I forgot about that. And made $0.37 billion in profits. Wow. The figure for private correction is one area where we are including civil and criminal costs. While these immigration detention facilities, many of which are private, and the confinement, there are technically civil. In reality, they are quite prison-like. Right, and we've seen that with recent headline events that honed in on the discussions on immigration and children being separated from their parents, etc., etc. People in federal prison for criminal convictions of violating federal immigration laws and people detained civilly in local jails under contract with U.S. immigration and custom enforcements are included in public corrections costs. All right, so just real quick, they're giving you just other deep dive information that you can get into. Again, I will leave the link to this particular study in the description of this video, and you can certainly go in and get to their direct sources to get additional information. And then they're also giving acknowledgments to some folks as well in here. So you see this information as well. So this was very well put together, quite informative. Again, this is from the Prison Policy Initiative, and this is following the money of mass incarceration, right? So I hope that you got a lot of value out of this. If you are not subscribed to us, I highly encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this video. We have been taking a hiatus on our live broadcast. We will be back shortly in a couple weeks with our live broadcast as well. So stay tuned. You can keep updated with us by definitely hitting the subscribe button and hitting notifications so you can get these news updates, and you can also know when we are going live. So I want to thank you for listening. I wish everyone well on this Monday. This is Pretense of Justice News Update. Peace and love.